very much like to introduce the Chair's address, which obviously Jonathan, as Chair of Committee for England, is going to give. And his topic for this afternoon is quite appropriate for a Sunday afternoon: churches, churchyards and cemeteries. So over to you, Jonathan, please.
Thank you. I'm going to try and progress fairly rapidly through this, and we'll see how we go. So in some senses, this is part 2 of the address that I gave last year, which was how I became a botanist. And some of the story starts when my parents moved to the old rectory in Doddleston near Chester, where my bedroom was the closest room to the church. And one evening, clanging from the tower here drew me across. And hopefully you heard some bells ringing in a tower. The picture wasn't the bells, and neither are these in the church that I illustrated. But bell ringing has taken me to quite a number of churchyards, most recently with the Oxford and Cambridge University students, to churchyards in Warwickshire, some of which didn't seem to have had many records ever, somewhat to my surprise. So I think this particular churchyard I recorded as well as I could, as it only had 3 previous records in the database. It's also taken me overseas to places like Cape Town, the Falkland Islands and South Georgia. And here there's an interesting question concerning aliens. You can see some fairly common plants. You can see the white flower heads of yarrow and some dandelions, and on the gravel there's some sheep sorrel. Those are all aliens on South Georgia and must be exterminated at all costs. Whereas in the foreground, you can see some of the flower heads of Echinum magellanica, which of course would be an alien that must be eradicated at all costs in the UK. When I had done my A-levels, I went to Cambridge as a student, and there I rang at St Benet's Church. And churchyards can have interesting flora attached to them, and this particular one had our first county record of a little bellflower, which was on a chest tomb in the churchyard, but that seems to have disappeared with some restoration work that was done on the church. The churchyard itself is very tiny, but in the grass there, at least until a few years ago, there was Gallium verum still persisting. In the tower, there's a ring of bells, and these are hung on a piece of wood, which is attached to roller bearings. There's a wheel attached to the piece of wood and a rope attached to the wheel. And by pulling in time on the rope, you can get the bell to swing through nearly 360 degrees. The bit of wood sticking downwards stops the bell from going completely round. And because you're ringing in a 360 degree arc, you can control the speed of the bell. And that is quite important when it comes to English change ringing, where you build up patterns by alternately swapping pairs of bells. And on 6 bells, there's 720 different combinations, which takes about 20 minutes to perform. And a full peal, it involves 7 of those, which takes about 3 hours. In the churchyards themselves, there are sometimes tombstones that are dedicated to bell ringers. And on a recent Cambridgeshire Flora Group excursion, we were somewhat amused to find this one to the chief bell ringer of the parish. I'm not sure that anybody has a title like that today. Now, this is a sneak preview from the atlas, but you can see that Cambridge itself has a very high number of recording days, as does the county as a whole. And in part, at least, that's because of the number of churchyards that are around and about. And each one needs to be recorded as an individual entity. So when you have lots of churchyards, you'll have lots of recording days going on. And for last year, I wrote a short paper on the flora of Cambridgeshire churchyards, and I've slightly modified that paper to give an account of some of the alien flora in churchyards as well. So the first thing to look at is what types of churchyards there are. And this one is a city wildlife site, but it's a closed churchyard, and that means closed for burials. And as such, it's managed by the city council. And the city councils generally don't have much in the way of resources. So their traditional form of management is cut and drop. And there you can see some of the cuttings that they've dropped. And this just forms a dense mat that then kills off all the better plants and fertilizes what remains. Another approach is just total neglect. And this cemetery is, again, a city wildlife site. But in recent years, the mowing has stopped and it's been left to nature to get on with what it wants to develop into. And mostly that's scrub and bramble. And again, the nicer species of flower that we might hope to be there are reducing in number. Other cemeteries are well-known lawns. This particular one, though, is also a county wildlife site because of its unusual flora. Sometimes you have to get quite close up to see it. And this particular site is on one of our rare sandy areas of the green sands around Gamlingay. Peter Leonard here is not actually looking at the alien flowers on the left. He's looking at some little white crucifers that were growing on that particular gravestone. Again, this is another county wildlife site. But here it's rather differently managed, and it's perhaps the optimum management. Some ground is kept shortly mown, but other parts are allowed to flower and set seed. And then a team of volunteers cuts the grass with a brush cutter and rakes it all up and takes it off so that the ground isn't fertilized. And if I remember, this was a particularly wet and noxious day. And so the grass wasn't rakeable very easily. And yet other churchyards are kept more for amenity than anything else, and really don't have very many species of particular note. So for this report, I produced a table showing the commonest species of churchyards. And these can be divided up into certain groups. One is some of the ubiquitous species, such as nettle, elder, ribwort plantain, and so on. And they're as frequent in the wider countryside as they are in churchyards. Yew, on the other hand, is much more frequent in Cambridgeshire churchyards, at any rate, than it is in the wider countryside. And this is partly because it's associated with historic planting, supposedly to provide wood for longbows. However, in practice, most of the wood for good longbows was imported from the continent. The shortly mown habitat of churchyards provides a good habitat for species like Bellis perennis daisy, and it's more frequent in our churchyards than it is in the wider countryside, at least in part because in the north of the county, where we have fenland, it's really only found on the isolated dwellings and in their lawns. And so that, I think, biases the statistics, at least for Cambridgeshire, because the habitat is not uniform across the county. Similarly, plants like Potentilla reptans, Prunella vulgaris and Veronica commideris share a similar liking for relatively short grassland. Now, for most counties, there's an objective to produce a rare plant register. The Cambridgeshire one is called the Register of Plants of Conservation Concern, largely because some of the species that are listed in it are actually still relatively common in the county. So the Rare Plant Register should certainly include those species that are scarce or rare in the county, but it also includes species that have a threat level in England, Great Britain, or even Europe, although they may be common locally. And then you have plants that are under threat in the county and are perhaps declining, although they may still be relatively common. And these are the first few entries. My register is a relatively simple tabular format, which just lists the species. Some of these will be fairly common in other parts of England, but they make it into our list. The list does include a few alien species, and one is the purple toothwort, Lothrea clandestina, which probably escaped or was planted out from the University Botanic Garden into a nearby area of fenland near the river. And I've also added Elodia canadensis because, as Mark's mentioned in his talk, it is declining now. And very often when you come across it, you think, oh, this is a nice plant. It's illustrating a relatively good habitat. Slightly different to the Register of Plants of Conservation Concern are the axiophytes. Those are the species that when you come across them, you say, oh, that's quite a nice species. And the Cambridgeshire list is based on tetrad occupancy, and it's basically plants that are not very common and equally not very rare. And they're not invasive aliens, and they're not planted trees and so on. But sometimes the plants are too common to be on the RPCC, but equally too rare to be actually classed as an axiophyte. Again, here's the first few species that qualify as axiophytes. And you can see that some are not only axiophytes, they are RPCC species. So taking those two classes together, we can see which of them grow in churchyards, and there are quite a number that do. One of the commonest ones is Plantago media, and we'll see why that might be the case in a moment. And also plants like Rumix acetosa. And I'm not quite sure why that is disproportionately, if you like, more common in churchyards. So two that we can give a fairly good reason why they might be are Plantago media and Salvia verbenaca, which both have basal leaves that lie flat to the ground. So when the lawnmower comes along and cuts the flowering plant down, at least the vegetative parts remain. And I think that certainly enhances their chances of survival. I think a few species these days are perhaps being introduced in wildflower mixes, and Nautiera arvensis fieldscavis may be an example of this, because over the last few years, it does seem to have increased a little in frequency. So that's something that we will need to watch. And at least locally, because Alan Leslie is the expert on Ranunculus ericomus, we know that there are 7 different species of the plant from Cambridgeshire churchyards. And he also says that there are some unnamed species present as well. These probably originally did quite well in churchyards because the traditional management would be scything the grass after plants had flowered. But these days, management is often done by lawnmowers and strimmers, and this may be leading to a decline. When you look at which churchyards have the most of these species, we see that some of them are designated as city or county wildlife sites, but there are some that are not. And it's interesting to note that there are plans for a new survey of sites in Cambridgeshire and I think Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire, to see which places might, in today's impoverished flora, be potentially worth designation as important sites in the counties. What we haven't actually addressed so far is what actually is an alien species. And so here I've looked at what the Plant Atlas, or Plant-At, which is a different thing, tells us. So we can have alien casuals, which are mostly crop plants, alien neophytes, these are species that have arrived in this country after 1500, alien archaeophytes, which I think we by and large recognise as nice plants that we'd really like to keep. And then there can be alien hybrids that have arisen naturally because species have been brought into this country. The genuine natives, there are some that the status is a bit uncertain. There are some species that are endemic to Britain, and then there are hybrids here as well. So what I've done is I've done a database query and asked which of these alien casuals and neophytes are present in Cambridgeshire churchyards, and have got this list of the top 10 because we quite like top 10s. And this is perhaps as you might expect, but these plants probably can be split into a few different categories. There are some ubiquitous plants that are as frequent in churchyards as they are in the wider countryside. And here I've illustrated the sycamore, the horse chestnut, the buddleia, and the dreaded green alkanet, which is really probably one of the most invasive things that we have. Then there's Veronica persica, the cornfield speedwell, which is ubiquitous in the wider countryside, but contrast that with Veronica filiformis, which is disproportionately more frequent in churchyards. And this is, I think, largely because it likes the shortly mown grass, and it's spread by lawnmowers vegetatively. So the small fragments, particularly in those closed churchyards, can be spread by council mowers. At least locally, we don't have very many naturally rocky areas. So some aliens are preferentially more frequent in towns than they are in the wider countryside, and particularly on churchyard walls. And here I've just illustrated a couple, such as Centranthus reba, red valerian, and Cymbalarium muralis, the ivy-leaved toadflax. Ferns also do quite well both on churches and churchyard walls. And one of our scarce ferns, the Splenum cataract or rustyback, is present in a couple of churchyards, as is the alien terrace species. We've got two different ribbon ferns growing in Cambridgeshire churchyards. We've only got one site in the county for Polypodium cambricum, and it's on the outside of a cemetery wall. And I'm sort of a little bit uncertain whether this should be counted as part of the cemetery list, or whether it should be really part of the wider urban environment. In the Babington flora of Cambridgeshire, he noted that Erigeron acris, blue fleabane, grew on the churchyard wall at Fenditton, which is a church fairly near to Cambridge, much frequented by the rowers. It's known as the Rowers' Church. And while we haven't seen that there on recent surveys, and a relative Erigeron carvinskianus is well established on the wall. I hasten to add that the illustration is not of the churchyard wall, but of a city wall in Cambridge. And then some species are preferentially planted in churchyards, and this particularly applies to the snowdrops and winter aconites that are in flower at the moment. And the top illustration also shows one of the more invasive aliens, Petasites pyrenaicus, the winter heliotrope. But there are some nice churchyard aliens which don't qualify as axiophytes, but are only included in our register because they were in our historic online register. But nevertheless, I would always think it nice if I came across one of these in a churchyard. The Register of Plants of Conservation Concern also includes a listing of invasive species, and I've given them sort of 3 threat levels. One, which is where they're currently being removed from county or city wildlife sites. One where it may be being removed but doesn't have a particular impact at the moment, or maybe should be removed because it will have a future impact, and others that are just ones to watch for because they've shown a significant increase over the last decade. And you'll see a few of the things that are increasing there, some of which we definitely wouldn't find in churchyards, but we'll see a few of those in the next couple of slides. One of the dreaded ones is Heterohibernica, the Irish ivy. And here you can see a tide of the ivy sweeping across some Aranthis hyemalis. And in the background there, we've got the Rubus armeniacus, the Himalayan giant, which produces those large succulent berries and has escaped from gardens, but is now increasingly a problem in the wider countryside. One lesser recognised species, which I've only included in this talk because it appeared in the latest BSBI news as an adventive alien, is the Papaver atlanticum, the Atlas poppy. And in one of our churchyards, it is certainly becoming much more frequent. And so I think this is one of those that need to be on the watch out for it list, because it can swamp other species out. We've had Allium paradoxum mentioned already today, and it's now present in 7 churchyards. And in some cases, it has been deliberately planted in them, despite its introduction into the wild being an offence. So very often we do get some misguided intentions of introducing species to churchyards. Perhaps a strange one, which is a native species, at least on the coast, but is increasingly being found along road verges, and in this case in a local churchyard, is Smyrnium olusatrum. And as you can see in this picture, it's forming really quite a dense sward in a corner of this churchyard. The same churchyard is actually having a problem with another species that's native, and this is cropping up now in quite a few Cambridgeshire churchyards, Carexter volza grey sedge, and it really does form dense mats. So native, yes, but it is potentially becoming a problem. Whether this is a response to climate change or nutrient enrichment, I just don't know. And even our common ivy, Heterohelix can be a problem species, swamping many areas. But we have to remember that churchyards are not just places for flowering plants. There are many other things of conservation concern in them, such as wax-cap fungi and lichens on tombstones. This one isn't actually in a churchyard. It's a memorial to someone in a common that's not that far from Cambridge, who was struck by lightning on a summer's day. And by coincidence, I happened to be in the same place on the same day of the year that the chap was struck down by lightning. But fortunately, there was no risk of thunder on that particular occasion. And there are also bryophytes. And here's one in one of our Cambridgeshire churchyards, which shows a relatively rare moss that is growing on one of the monuments. There's a national charity that works on providing good advice for the care of churchyards, and that's called Caring for God's Acre. And also on local levels, I think many of the wildlife trusts have their conservation award schemes to encourage churches to go for the best management. This doesn't always work, and sometimes some misguided things happen. So this is in our city wildlife site. They've decided to plant a tree in probably the most species-rich area of the churchyard, really quite close to the church itself. And this is probably a mistake. There is also a desire for instant results. So rather than letting nature improve the biodiversity, there's a rapid sowing quite often of alien prairie species because it looks pretty and comes in quick. However, I think that the future will see more churchyards receiving wildlife site designations as we appreciate their value in providing link habitats for nature recovery. There are some threats, and I've shown you a couple of them. In fact, I've probably shown all of these, but there's also opportunities, and I think we are now putting more value on biodiversity, and also churchyards are very accessible places that people can go to see wildflowers. So I think we need to encourage that. Let's go into the churchyard, not only to look at the tombstones or go there for prayer, but also look at what nature is present in them. So I've sneaked a load of pictures from a number of sources, including Wikipedia, the online atlas, and some of our local photographers. And I'm sorry to say that most of them aren't from churchyards, but I hope that's given you a little bit of an insight to some of the species that might be around.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for that talk. You've obviously been very busy with all your recording and then producing your booklet. I think there is one question in the Q&A.
Yeah, shall I do the Q&A one? I've got it up on my screen. So there's a note from John Handley saying that there's no regulations on wildflower seed, although changes in farm payment schemes will be incentivising farmers to plant mixtures on a much larger scale. Although, as botanists, we're keen to see new and interesting plants turning up, is there a potential for problems? And I think this is definitely the case. I know Mark Spencer in London is beginning to see some of the wildflower mixes that were sown in association with the London Games spreading out from their sown sites. And so, yes, I think we will be seeing them more widespread. Whether any of them are going to become problem plants and be invasive, I'm not so certain. But I think we do need to make sure that we're watching out and looking at those dot maps to see, have we got any species that seem to be spreading. And for my own local county as a Vice County Recorder, I've update the Register of Plants of Conservation Concern on an annual basis for the plants that are rarer or threatened. But the invasive list I'll probably be doing every 5 years. And I think that's a sort of reasonable timescale. And that hopefully will flag up anything that's on the horizon.
If I could just, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Mary.
I was just going to ask one question. You'd mentioned that more churchyards are likely to be put on the local wildlife sites, but then there is the potential for mismanagement. If they go as a local wildlife site, do they have a source, a contact? Is it through the local authority where they can get advice on managing their wildlife sites to try and prevent this type of thing happening?
Yes, I'm sure the system will be slightly different between different counties, but here in Cambridgeshire and for that matter Bedfordshire and Northamptonshire, the local wildlife trust is responsible for doing surveys of the designated sites. And what they normally do is when they do a survey, they will put together some management recommendations and also assessment of what state the site is in. And so those management recommendations will include advice as to how to maintain the value of the site. And certainly with the Cambridgeshire scheme, there's 3 levels. There's the entry level scheme, which you basically don't have to do very much apart from having a churchyard and look after it. But then there's a silver level and a gold level. And for each of those, you have to be taking more and more active management to ensure the continuity of the existing habitat. And that partly answers Julia's question as to whether there's interaction with the church wardens and other church members. With these local awards, the church warden or a member of the PCC almost invariably accompanies the inspection to give feedback in both directions. So to explain to the people doing the judging, and I've judged several of these churchyards, why they're doing things in a certain way. And for some churchyards, there's pressure in 2 directions. Some of the parishioners want the churchyard really neat and tidy, and others want more nature in it. And the church has to balance those 2 perspectives. And so one of the solutions is to enable the parishioners who want the graves neat and tidy to do their own management around their own grave. And that then gives ownership, which I think is a really big part of these things. When you have ownership of the project or whatever, you're much more immersed in it than if you're told to do it by some remote authority. So I think it's really important to be involved in these sort of things.
Yes, I'd agree, and let's hope that going forward, the biodiversity of the churchyards is considered important, and people will work towards maintaining it. Could we just all then thank Jonathan again with a round of applause for his chair's address? Thank you, Jonathan.